But I have something more to show you today.
Oh.
You know, we want to take advantage of the next generation of consoles to enter a new genre. You know, the open world online RPG. So this game is brought to you by one of the best studios in the world, Massive Entertainment. So let's watch it. Thank you.
Tom Clancy's The Division had, if nothing else, a strong entrance. When it was revealed at Ubisoft's E3 2013 conference, it was with a trailer that really caught eyes from all angles. The 8th generation of consoles were on the way, and everyone was looking for that big AAA headliner to show off what they could do. And one glance at The Division created some very high hopes. The mix of grounded-looking tactical combat and light survival elements looked like a lot of fun, and visually it blew everything on the market out of the water. Its apocalyptic New York City setting had an almost suspicious attention to detail. Your guy even closed car doors and taking cover next to him. That's awesome! Everything was shaping out to be great. In retrospect, it's not hard to see the warning signs here. Between the blatantly keyframed aiming and the weirdly good animation and the
brace for PvP.
This was anything but standard gameplay footage. When you stop and think about something like the UI design, it's hard to imagine the game was ever going to work this way. There's also a few details that are very 2013, like having someone play with a companion app, as was the style at the time. Still, the game seemed promising. I mean, surely it can't go too wrong, right? We were set to find out next year. The game was delayed to next year. Everything's probably fine, it happens. The game was delayed to next year. Again, almost exactly a year after the last delay as it happens. But Ubisoft says everything's fine. The game came out, and everything was not fine. There were server problems as expected, but the issues ran much deeper than that. Poor game systems just were not designed properly. People had to form multiplayer bread lines to get quests. Combat was a slog, with enemies taking insane amounts of damage before going down. The balancing for equipment and skills was a mess. The open world activities were boring as sin. There was no real endgame to speak of. The story was basically non-existent. The visuals got downgraded from the original trailer, and it wasn't even set in the same place. You could, however, still close car doors. So, naturally, Division 1 is not fondly remembered by general audiences. They didn't get what they wanted, and what they actually did get wasn't great either. Personally, I still kind of like it, even if I doubt that sometimes when I actually play it. Downgraded though it may be, the grim atmosphere of its snowy New York streets is still unequaled, and it's enough to carry the immersion in lieu of any worthwhile narrative. That mythical attention to detail isn't missing either. Almost everything reacts to being shot or bumped in some way, so much so that it can kind of start to feel ridiculous. Ultimately though, I still have to grant that the gameplay is not great. It isn't the worst thing ever, it more or less works, but its flaws feel pretty glaringly obvious when playing it, and dumping a small platoon's worth of ammunition into one dude isn't doing the believability any favors. It's just that those vibes are enough to carry me through all that. Regardless, The Division faded out of the public consciousness for a while, outside of the diehards sticking it out for updates and DLC, yada yada yada, surely nothing that interesting, until The Division 2 comes out, and it's a lot better! Almost every issue people had with the first game has been addressed in spades. Gameplay is much improved, with quicker time to kill both ways and dramatically better balancing. Open world activities are actually fun, there was a meaty endgame right off the bat, story still sucked, and its Washington DC setting looked very nice indeed. The game is mostly lauded as a fantastic sequel by both critics and community, and all is right in the world. In 2020, it gets a great expansion with Warlords of New York, before slowing down to a seasonal live service limbo for years to come. I really like The Division 2. It's about the only looter shooter I'll tolerate, honestly. There's a very speedy rhythm to it that its kin lacks. Even when you're knee-deep in ultra-turbo hyper endgame, there's countless systems in place encouraging you to experiment with different builds and playstyles rather than spend 50 hours of your time grinding for god rolls. It helps that the gameplay is actually fun this time. It's a lot snappier and there's very tangible build variety. I only wish it retained more of the original's atmosphere. Division 2's is fine. It has that Ubisoft feel, you know how it is. It just doesn't match the moodiness of the original for me. There's more stuff on the horizon for the Division series, but we'll come back to that. In the meantime, let's wind back the clock and get to the actual subject of the video. So, it's 2016. The Division 1 is still addled by crippling problems, and you know what that means. It's DLC time. The first DLC, Underground, is a randomly generated dungeon for the endgame grind. It's fine, it works. It's not terribly interesting, but it's essentially utilitarian, so whatever. The Summit from Warlords acts as its direct successor, and it's broadly an improvement. The second DLC is where the developers at Massive pulled out the wild card, with a very unexpected new mode. This mode would be quite different not just from the base game, but from nearly everything else on the market, and its absence from public memory is the reason I'm making this video. It's called Survival, and I'm gonna take you through it.
Better get yourself into a hazmat suit, Agent. We just got word that the experimental antivirals lost in the Dark Zone have been located. There's no time to wait. You and a team need to go secure them right now, or someone else will.
Come on, move it! We don't have much time! We need to be in the air before the storm hits!
But we've got a storm coming in. They say it'll make Sandy look like a snowball fight. We're locking the base down for the duration, and Rhodes says the weather might bork all our comms, so we can't count on being in contact.
Hold on! We'll be there soon!
Just get there before the storm really hits. And listen, do whatever you need to do to get back alive. You're needed. Row out.
This cutscene plays at the start of every run of Survival. You can't skip it. Beginning a multiplayer match with a long cutscene may seem like a strange decision, and it honestly is, but it's indicative of the headspace that the designers were operating in. If you wanted a bare mechanical explanation of Survival as a game mode, I would tell you it's a single life elimination mode for up to 24 players. It's mainly PvE, but you can have PvP if you want it. Rounds last in the 40 to 60 minute range, potentially a little shorter, maybe a lot longer. You start at a random point on the map without any equipment, and you have to loot and craft your way up to a proper loadout. There's some survival mechanics, and the final goal is extraction with a plot MacGuffin. But that kind of approach doesn't do Survival justice. There's a narrative and tonal bent to its design that looking at as a typical multiplayer mode passes over entirely. Anybody who's familiar with it could tell you that the raw gameplay, enjoyable as it may be, isn't really the point. We're gonna break this down piece by piece because there's a lot to get to, but we have to start at the real core of Survival. We have to start with the vibe. Survival may be the most oppressively bleak thing I've ever played in my life. Every moment you play it feels tense and uncomfortable. Even in the calmest moments, things are getting worse. Not so quickly as to rush you, but just enough to give you that sinking feeling. If you're lucky, you can put it off, but that only grants an illusion of security. The only real option is to push forward into the hazy unknown of the storm, but the fog is impenetrable and anything could be out there. That air of uncertainty never leaves you. It's an atmosphere of abject misery that you can only get when every part of the experience is pulling in the same direction. The pursuit of it informs the rest of Survival's creation. Gameplay, visuals, music, all of them are on the same page here. So, let's break it down. In a strange move for a live service DLC, Survival is almost entirely divorced from the rest of the main game mechanically. Not a single thing follows you into the mode, and only some loot caches you can get late into the match will follow you back out. The convenient result is that you can basically treat Survival as a totally standalone experience if you like. There's no level requirement on it, so if you don't care about Division 1 at all, you can just make a character, run through the first hour of tutorials, and then only ever queue for Survival. Given the rest of the game, that might not be the worst idea. Coming from the rest of the series, the most immediate and important mechanical shift in Survival is, appropriately, the addition of survival mechanics. These mainly come in the form of 4 new systems: Infection, Temperature, Hunger, and Thirst. That rather undignified landing earlier left with a nice case of sepsis, along with a life expectancy of about an hour. This timer ticks down constantly and will instantly kill you for good when it hits 0. However, you can slow its progression. When looting, you can sometimes find painkillers and non-specific medicine that will briefly pause the timer. Painkillers stopping it for 2 minutes, and medicine stopping it for 5. The catch is that these become less effective with every use. By the end of a long run, both barely make a difference, so extraction is the only real escape from the infection. Realistically, it's not all that likely to kill you. you can fairly comfortably finish a run without using medicine at all if you just focus on the objective. That said, the encouragement to manage the timer with supplies does a good job of maintaining that sense of impending doom, as does having a death timer sitting in the corner at all times. Temperature is a much more immediately dire problem. Given the blizzard, it's quite cold outside, and that dinky hazmat suit you start with isn't gonna help. Anytime you're not indoors or near a heat source, this little bar in the corner ticks down, and if it empties, your health starts ticking down instead. With your starting gear, this happens very quickly, so you'll have to dart between pockets of safety to not freeze to death. On the bright side, you can do something about it. Clothing items in Division are usually just cosmetic, but survival gives them warmth stats, so the more you bundle up, the longer you can endure the elements. Clothing items can either be looted or crafted, and the hunt for them defines the start of any survival match. Meanwhile, hunger and thirst won't outright kill you, but they will make your life a lot harder. The main game will let your health fully regenerate when combat ends. Survival will not. It will only allow health to naturally regenerate up to the current segment. You could use a medkit to top it off, but for reasons we'll get to, they're too important to be using willy-nilly like that. However, eating food enables slow health regeneration up to your maximum even while in combat. This makes eating your best way to stave off long-term damage. Thirst plays a more minor role, drinking improves the visibility of lootable objects, and going thirsty for too long drops it substantially. Scavenging for supplies is essential in survival, so this can be more important than you may expect. Since we're in the neighborhood, survival has a lot of other smart changes from the main game. For one, the HUD is typically hidden outside of combat, and the radar is gone entirely. This means that until you can invest in Pulse, you'll have to rely on your eyes and ears to identify enemies. As mentioned before, medkits are highly valuable in this mode. They're decently rare, and you're initially limited to carrying 2, though with crafting you can upgrade this to 3. Critically, you can use them to self-revive when down, so they're lifesavers in solo play. That said, enemies are very proactive in trying to finish you off now, so maybe crawl to cover first. Reviving dead players also costs a medkit. Crafting plays a more pivotal role here than usual. It's present in both Division 1 and Division 2, but honestly it's mostly just used to reroll exotics. In survival, it's your lifeline, and it's the only way to get your hands on specific weapons and gear. The bulk of what you loot is either crafting materials or extra gear that you can scrap for parts. You can use these materials at crafting benches at the safe houses scattered around the map. You're required to do it a bit just to extract, but it's also where you'll make some of your most useful gear, and it's the only way to acquire shade tech skills. Finally, there's the elephant in the room with all Division 1 discussion: enemy health. Div 1's enemies are pretty infamous for being spongy. This is absolutely true. Part of the issue can be attributed to its design. After all, Div 2 isn't nearly as bad about it, but part of it's also just endemic to looter shooters as a whole. Survival is, mercifully, able to skirt the issue somewhat. Since the entire gear progression is happening over about an hour, things like weapon damage are a lot more standardized, and enemy health is balanced accordingly, so enemies are less egregiously spongy than elsewhere. The sponge is far from gone, mind you, but it's under control. You make a good tactical decision, you deal a good amount of damage, you can get used to it. These changes color the experience on your way to the actual objective, retrieving the antiviral case and extracting from the area. Doing that is a more complicated process than it initially seems. The antivirals are located inside the Dark Zone, the most heavily contaminated and occupied area of the city, so you need to craft a good mask and gather decent equipment before you head in. The experience of a survival match can be pretty tightly split into pre-Dark Zone and post-Dark Zone stages, as there's a major progression between the two. Technically, everything outside the Dark Zone is called the Light Zone, but considering the circumstances, that doesn't feel too apt. Looting and survival are the stars of the show pre-Dark Zone. Because you start with basically nothing, scrounging for gear is your highest priority, and the cold absolutely will kill you if you're not careful. Weapons are hard to come by, so you're going to be falling back on your pistol for a while. It's good to avoid enemies at this stage, but when you're freezing to death and the only nearby shelter is through a group of Rikers, you may not have the luxury of choice.
Nice, easy move. Do what you need to do.
Early combat consists of scrappy pistol shootouts with poor visibility. Without shade tech skills, the silhouettes of enemies in the fog are all you have to go on. Above all else, it feels desperate. Neither you nor your enemies feel equipped for a fight, and even when you have decent weapons, they're the weapons you can find, not the weapons you want. Once you have more to work with, you can start tackling landmarks around the map. These have more heavily armed enemy squads, but score you enough decent equipment that you can start seriously thinking about the Dark Zone. Strictly speaking, these are optional, but hitting 2 or 3 can be a good call just to stock up on loot and crafting materials. Crossing over into the Dark Zone marks a turning point in the run. By now you should be kitted out enough that the blizzard doesn't pose too much of a threat to you. You've got proper guns, the temperature bar is taking its sweet time, and you're not likely to starve. But once you hop the wall into the dark zone, the priority shifts. The weather gets clearer and basic supplies are abundant, but in exchange, there are far more and far tougher enemies than on the outside. Now, you have to battle your way down every street, and landmarks become the stage for the heaviest fighting in the mode. If you can bring down the named enemies at them, they drop survival caches for the main game, which contain pretty good stuff. Battles here resemble the regular Division experience more closely, though with a lot more tension since you're upwards of half an hour into a permadeath run. When you signal for extraction, a new enemy type called the Hunter arrives to take you down. These can use a lot of the same shade tech skills as the player, and can even execute you with a tomahawk if you're downed. I don't have any footage of that though, because as you can see, they're not actually that difficult to kill. There's a tangible gulf in gameplay between the start and end of a survival match, and it gives the mode a really satisfying arc. Going from the slower, survival-focused first half to the more combat-oriented back half creates a very tangible sense of escalation that keeps the tension feeling fresh. It's a similar feeling of constant pressure, but it's coming from a different source entirely. One that's much more immediately intimidating, and has guns. The result is that even though survival matches aren't actually all that randomized, it doesn't feel too repetitive to play it over and over again like I did for this video. It's a very roguelite kind of loop. That said, I do have some gripes. The Dark Zone landmarks don't really have any incentive to do them within the context of the mode, since all you get are those caches. But in fairness, it is ultimately a part of Division 1, it has to feed back into it somehow. The game also scores your run at the end, so if you care about that, then you do have a reason to go for them. Or you can be a goblin like me and just max out your survival caches for sport and then never open them. The antivirals are always just sitting in a corner somewhere with little resistance, so I don't see why those aren't at the landmarks. Again, hunters are complete pushovers and most skills aren't that useful, but that's just a Div 1 problem in general. At the end of the day, these are all pretty forgivable issues. All of this comes together to make a gameplay experience that is both fun and surprisingly compelling, both of which are frankly miracles for anything built off of the Division 1. The mechanics are remarkably in tune with the vibe survival is going for, and even if it wasn't backed up by the presentation at all, I think I'd still really like playing it. That's hypothetical though. The presentation is incredible. It's kind of insane to me how well Survival's presentation comes together. First and foremost, I know I talked about the graphics downgrade earlier, but let's be real here, Division 1 still looks fantastic. I mean, even 8 years on, I don't think any game really needs to look better than this. The lighting, fog, and asset quality are all top shelf no matter how you slice it, and if it wasn't being compared to a marginally better looking version of itself, nobody would have complaints about it. That said, it did always look better at night or when it was foggy and snowing. Conveniently, Survival takes place entirely at night when it's foggy and snowing. I could go into detail, but, well, look at it. You can see it, it looks stunning. I realize that YouTube compression will probably decimate the snow, but this is really the best looking depiction of a snowstorm I've ever seen in a game. And what I can only imagine was a soul-rending amount of work for some poor level artist. It seems like they've even layered more snow onto the entire map. I think the lighting is what really brings it together though. The Division games have always been great at volumetrics and particle lighting, and Survival setting is absolutely perfect for showing that off. The snowstorm is also my favorite implementation of genuinely poor visibility in a game. Even on a map I've spent literal days playing on, the extremely thick fog and the removal of the radar blankets everything in this sense of uncertainty. Games typically do that with sheer darkness, which is fine, but being able to faintly make out the silhouettes of enemies against distant street lamps feels so much more disconcerting and mysterious to me. Having all of this in downtown Manhattan of all places makes it even better. It feels almost surreal when the lights of Times Square just barely tear through the haze above you. Honestly, it feels more apocalyptic than most games set in actual apocalypses do. But of all this, I would be remiss not to mention the soundtrack. Ola Strand's been the go-to composer for the Division series since the start, and it's hard to imagine it without his work. While I think that only a handful of songs in the first game's soundtrack are particularly memorable, there's a trademark sound to it that absolutely is. That soundtrack faded into the background a bit too much though, so the soundtracks for Division 2 and its DLC leaned away from the orchestra and towards heavier synths and one of those giant electric guitar walls. The result was 2 soundtracks worth of stone cold bangers. But neither of these would ever quite fit Survival. We needed music that pulled the tone along with everything else, and Strand came through with what I think is an absolutely perfect soundtrack. Now, I'm no big brain music boy. If you ask me to assign something to a specific genre, I'm gonna spit out the dumbest sentence you've ever heard in your life. So instead, I'm just going to make one up and say that this is ominous electronic before anyone can tell me otherwise. It's hard to overstate just how essential Survival's music is to its atmosphere. Questionable traditional wisdom says that silent equals tense. Massive obviously either missed the memo or wisely ignored it on purpose because Survival has music playing all the time.
Nothing.
That goes a long way towards tying the experience together. Given its style, any song on the soundtrack can easily blend into any other, so like the gameplay, the music is never static. It backs up the feeling of constant tension. The combat music never really starts, and it never really stops, it only weaves in and out of the ambience. And that's not to mention the combat music itself. So much of the feeling of desperation in Survival's combat can be attributed to the combat music. Even when you're near the end of a run and the combat is more or less just regular Division 1, those harsh synths make it feel like a feral scramble to survive for both sides. And again, there's never a clear endpoint to that scramble, except for one. The only time the Survival soundtrack lets up entirely is when you reach a safe house and are met with the most relieving sound in the world. This soundtrack is just... it's so good, man. It's so good. The whole presentation is perfect, no notes. Superlative statements are only bad if they're wrong, right? Survival rules, dude. It's such a cool, immersive, and unique experience that it's honestly strange that it came out as DLC for The Division of all things. It could very easily be its own game, and considering how cheap it all goes on sale these days, you could pretty happily pretend that it is. But taking a step back, it's hard not to look at Survival and think what could have been for the rest of the game. I've seen people say it's a glimpse of what the original trailer sold us on, but honestly it's not. This is an entirely different thing, one that's way cooler. A game that feels as utterly cohesive and interesting as this is so hard to come by, and seeing it come from a AAA studio with a big budget IP attached is even weirder. I don't even know what to compare it to exactly. My gut says it reminds me of Stalker, but is that really accurate? It's quite a different thing, but it still has some of those oppressive vibes. Okay, by this point I have to address something. Is this a Battle Royale? Is it an extraction shooter? Is whichever of those two I put in the title clickbait? The answer to the last part is unequivocally yes, but it's interesting to think about because it doesn't cleanly fit into either genre. Everyone starts with nothing and has to loot their way up, which is a Battle Royale thing, but the goal is to extract from the map, which is obviously more in line with an extraction shooter. But the stuff you extract with is completely immaterial to the mode itself, so it doesn't really feel like an extraction shooter. PvP is completely opt-in, which is really strange for both and might disqualify it on all fronts. And we can't really say it took inspiration from either, because it mostly predates both. Heck, I'd say Division 1 was the first extraction shooter if you're just looking at Dark Zone. Honestly, there's no conclusion here. Who knows, it's all pedantic. Makes good clickbait though. What isn't pedantic is that Survival is cool and you should play it, but I do have a couple of words of advice for that. First of all, when you go to play it, use the game finder, not matchmaking. Matchmaking will try to put you with a full player squad, and because it's 2024, you'll be left waiting for all eternity. Game finder does none of that, it just puts you in a match as fast as it possibly can, and with how that's set up, it's a maximum wait of 6 minutes. There's not really any way around that 6-minute wait, you'll just have to deal with it. It seems like the PvE playlist fills up a bit faster, so I'd queue for that. With the map the size that it is and the player count being so low, you're probably not going to encounter anybody anyway, so you can just pretend it's single player. You can also run it with a squad of up to 3, but I'd recommend against doing that. It doesn't, not work, but the tense atmosphere is such a pillar of the experience, and you just lose it completely when you're playing anything with friends. It can be fun, it just isn't how you should experience the mode for the first time. So, Survival came out, it was a critical success, and had many fans excited for the future of the series. Everything was looking pretty good. I can't wait for what comes next. I'm still waiting. Yeah, Survival never came back. In any capacity, really. The mode's been widely forgotten except for unhinged fanatics like myself. After all, most people had moved on from The Division by the time it released. Division 2 came out and it was a great sequel to Division 1, but it was a great sequel to Division 1, which is kind of a bummer because Survival was a lot more interesting. There was talk of Survival being introduced to Div 2, but that was a long time ago now and I don't think it's gonna happen. The setting doesn't really lend itself well to the mode anyway. Washington DC is great and all, but it doesn't have those end-of-the-world vibes like New York did. The atmosphere just couldn't compare. There are future Division games, but it doesn't look super optimistic for Survival's return. Another Division 2 expansion is coming out next year, but we don't know jack about it. Division 3 has been announced, but that's about all there is to say on that, since it's still years away. There's Division Resurgence, which is a great value version of Division 1 for phones. Not a great start, and there's no indication Survival's gonna be there. Even if it was, it'd just be Div 1 Survival again, but worse. And that leaves the Division Heartland, which... Okay, so Heartland is being made by Red Storm. It's supposed to be a kind of successor to Survival. Yeah, see, it even says Survival Action right on its homepage, but I don't know about that. Now, I was invited to the closed alpha test back in July, but I was a little busy at the time, so I haven't actually played Heartland. That said, absolutely nothing I've seen of it inspires any confidence. Structurally, it looks much more like a standard extraction shooter. There are some boilerplate survival mechanics, but those aren't really what Division 1 Survival is all about. The critical issue is that I'm just getting no vibes from this at all. Not good vibes, not bad vibes, just straight nothing. Looking at footage gives you the impression that it's a game without much of a design target to aim at. Maybe it'll be good, I hope so, but I can't imagine it being good in the same ways as the mode it's ostensibly succeeding. And it's free to play, which, you know how that goes. So that just leaves us with good old Div 1 Survival. I'm glad I pulled off what I was going for so well, because it sure seems like nothing else ever will. I'm not optimistic that we'll ever see the dream of a fleshed out Division game in the survival template come to fruition. The mode is just too niche for the kind of broad audiences Ubisoft likes to work with. And it's a real shame we're talking about Ubisoft here, because the Division's an always online game. Those guys have an awful track record keeping those running. I mean, they shut down The Crew this year, and that's still incredibly well. Judging by that timeline, Div 1 could be on the chopping block before too long, and that's just a wash. Internet free man Ross Scott is taking this practice up with the courts, so if you want to support that, then head over to stopkillinggames.com and see what you can do in your territory. On that note, since Ubisoft is probably going to throw survival into a volcano by the time Division 3 comes out, can somebody please make a proper follow-up? Please. This isn't even a retrospective anymore, I don't have a conclusion, this is just me begging. You take the vibes of this, you mix it together with Stalker, and you have pretty much exactly the perfect game for me. Usually, I'd think crossing my fingers for someone to make exactly the game I want wouldn't work, but I got Pacific Drive this year, so I'm high on hopium. If anyone wants to do it, let me know. I can't fund you, but I'll buy it. Anyway, that's all from me. Go play Division 1 Survival if it exists at the time of you watching this. Next video, never. Or maybe. Nah. Unless. No, surely not. But what if?